Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a question that's been debated for centuries. Um, who really holds the power in U.S. policymaking?
It's a question that goes to the heart of how our democracy functions.
Exactly.
Whoa.
We're going to be examining a study that analyzed nearly 2,000 policy issues spanning from 1981 to 2002. And this study pitted four major theories of American politics against each other to see which one best explained how policy actually gets made.
We're talking about majoritarian electoral democracy, economic elite domination, majoritarian pluralism, and biased pluralism.
Okay, so let's break down those theories for our listeners. Starting with majoritarian electoral democracy. It sounds pretty straightforward, right? The idea that policy outcomes should reflect what the average citizen wants.
Exactly. It's the classic model of the people rule, where government policy is shaped by the will of the majority.
Okay. Then we have economic elite domination, which suggests that it's not the average voter calling the shots, but rather the wealthiest individuals or the elite.
Right. This theory posits that economic power translates into political power. So the affluent, by virtue of their resources and their influence, are able to shape policy to serve their own interests.
Makes sense. Then there's majoritarian pluralism. This theory shifts the focus to interest groups. The idea is that all these different interest groups are competing for influence and that this competition leads to policy outcomes that kind of balance everyone's preferences.
The key assumption here is that these interest groups are representing a broad spectrum of public interests, and that through this competition, everyone's voice is heard.
Okay, so it's like a marketplace of ideas where the best ones, or at least the most popular ones, rise to the top.
Precisely. And then finally, we have biased pluralism, which acknowledges that interest groups exist, but argues that some groups, and specifically business interests, wield disproportionate influence.
So in this model, corporations and industry associations have an outsized impact on policy, potentially sidelining the needs of the general public.
Exactly. They might have more resources to lobby policymakers, or they might have closer ties to those in power.
So four very different models, each with its own take on how power operates in American politics. Now, what's so fascinating about the study we're looking at is that it doesn't just theorize. It uses hard data to test these theories against each other.
They analyzed 1,779 specific policy issues, gathering data on public opinion, the preferences of economic elites, and the positions of various interest groups on each issue.
Wow, 1,779 policy issues. That's a lot of data. How did they measure these factors? For example, how did they figure out what the average citizen wanted?
For public opinion, they relied on national surveys, asking respondents whether they supported or opposed specific policy changes. So they had a direct measure of where the public stood on potential shifts in government policy.
Makes sense. And how did they define and measure the preferences of the economic elite?
They used survey respondents at the 90th percentile of income as a proxy for the truly wealthy. Acknowledging, of course, that this is an imperfect measure. The 90th percentile represents affluence, but not necessarily the top 1%.
Right. But the researchers argue that this limitation likely leads to an underestimate of elite influence. If they find a significant impact, even with this moderate measure, the true influence of the very wealthy could be even greater. That's a really important point.
Exactly. It's a conservative estimate.
Now, what about interest groups? How did they factor into the analysis?
They used sources like Fortune magazine's Power 25 lists and lobbying expenditure data to identify a diverse set of powerful interest groups. This included both mass-based organizations like citizen groups and business-oriented groups like industry associations.
So they were looking at the full spectrum of interest group activity.
Right. Then they meticulously coded the positions of these groups on each policy issue, whether they strongly supported, moderately opposed, or strongly opposed a given policy change.
So they were trying to capture the nuances of each group's stance.
Precisely. And with all this data, they could then statistically analyze which of the four theories best matched up with actual policy outcomes. It's an incredibly rigorous approach, moving beyond speculation to see which model holds up in the real world.
It's a fascinating study, and I'm eager to delve into their findings. But first, let's take a quick break.
So where do we go from here? I mean, these findings really challenge some of our basic assumptions about how our political system works.
Yeah, it's unsettling to think that the average citizen's voice might not carry as much weight as we'd like to believe.
Right. It makes you wonder about the whole idea of democratic accountability. If politicians are primarily responding to the preferences of economic elites and powerful interest groups, what does that say about the role of elections?
It's a big question. The study's authors acknowledge that their findings don't necessarily invalidate the concept of electoral accountability entirely.
Right. Politicians still need to get elected, and they can't completely ignore the preferences of the electorate.
So how do we make sense of this apparent disconnect between public opinion and policy outcomes?
Well, one possibility is that politicians are particularly attuned to the preferences of those citizens who are most likely to vote.
So maybe there's a subset of the electorate, the most engaged, the most informed, whose preferences actually do carry more weight.
Exactly. It's like a smaller, more influential electorate within the larger one.
That's an interesting thought. It suggests that maybe not all citizens are created equal in terms of their political influence.
It's also worth considering that politicians might be responding to public opinion in a more anticipatory way.
What do you mean?
Well, they might be trying to predict not just what the public wants now, but what they might want in the future, especially if an issue becomes more salient or controversial.
So they're looking ahead, trying to stay ahead of the curve and avoid potential backlash.
Right. It's a strategic way of thinking about public opinion.
That makes sense. The study also found that there's a strong status quo bias in the U.S. political system.
Oh, absolutely. It seems like it's much harder to change existing policies than it is to simply maintain the status quo.
And why is that?
Well, part of it has to do with the structure of our government, the separation of powers, bicameralism, federalism. All these things create multiple veto points, which makes it difficult to pass legislation even when there is broad public support for it.
So even if the public overwhelmingly wants something to change, the system itself makes it really difficult to actually make that change.
Exactly. And this has significant implications for understanding power dynamics.
How so?
Well, it means that those who benefit from the status quo, whether they're economic elites or powerful interest groups, they have a built-in advantage. They don't need to actively push for change. They simply need to prevent it.
So the system itself protects the interests of the already powerful.
That's one way to look at it. And this status quo bias helps explain why the study found such a big difference in influence between business-oriented interest groups and mass-based groups.
Right. Businesses often have a strong interest in maintaining the status quo, and they have the resources to block policies that might threaten their interests.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They can lobby, they can donate to campaigns, they can even file lawsuits to delay or obstruct policy changes.
Whereas groups that are pushing for change, they face an uphill battle.
Exactly. They're fighting against the inertia of the system itself.
The study also pointed to some areas where more research is needed.
Yeah, for instance, they focus primarily on economic elites.
But what about other forms of power and influence? What about those in high-level positions in government or the media or academia?
Exactly. Economic power isn't the only kind of power that matters.
Right. And they also used a limited set of interest groups in their analysis. What about more specialized or niche groups? Do they have any influence at all?
That's a good question. It's possible that different types of interest groups operate under different rules of engagement.
Maybe some have more access to policymakers or more leverage depending on their resources or their connections.
Exactly. And perhaps most importantly, the study focused on direct policy influence. What about the ability to set the agenda?
Right. Who decides which issues are even considered for policy action in the first place?
That's a crucial question, because if certain issues are systematically excluded from the agenda, then the public might not even get a chance to weigh in on them.
So it's not just about influencing policy decisions, it's also about shaping the conversation itself.
Exactly. And that's a powerful form of influence.
These findings are really thought-provoking, and they raise some serious questions about the future of American democracy.
They do. They challenge us to think critically about how our system works and whether it's truly serving the interests of all citizens.
As we've seen, this study's findings really raise some fundamental questions about power and democracy in the United States.
Right. It's not always comfortable to confront these kinds of realities, but it's essential if we want to have an honest conversation about how our system actually functions.
I completely agree. One of the most striking takeaways is that the average citizen, the very people who are supposed to be at the heart of a democratic system, they seem to have surprisingly little direct impact on policy decisions.
And it's especially concerning when you consider that this study focused on issues that were already deemed important enough to be included in national opinion surveys. These were topics that the public was already aware of and had formed opinions on. So if their preferences aren't even reflected in these cases, where do they matter?
It really makes you question whether our current system of representative democracy is truly representative. Are the voices of the people actually being translated into policy?
The authors of the study argue that when policy is consistently shaped by the preferences of a small, wealthy elite and powerful interest groups, often at the expense of the majority, it really undermines the legitimacy of our democracy.
And they highlight that the preferences of economic elites and organized interests tend to diverge from those of average citizens on a whole range of crucial issues, things like tax policy, trade, corporate regulation, social issues. So it's not just a matter of influence, it's also a matter of having different priorities.
Exactly. For example, the study found that economic elites often favor lower levels of government spending across the board, while business groups will frequently lobby for specific spending programs that benefit their industries, even if those programs are opposed by a majority of citizens.
So the wealthy aren't just wielding more influence, they're also using that influence to advocate for policies that might not align with the interests of ordinary Americans.
Right, and it raises the question of whose interests are really being served by our political system.
Now, some might argue that limited public influence isn't necessarily a bad thing. They might say that average citizens just don't have the kind of in-depth knowledge needed to make informed decisions on complex policy issues.
Right. There's this idea that we should defer to the judgment of experts or those with specialized knowledge. Let the people who really understand the intricacies of these issues guide the process.
But the authors of the study caution against simply assuming the superior wisdom of elites. They point out that expertise doesn't always guarantee a commitment to the common good. Even those with specialized knowledge can be driven by self-interest or by a narrow perspective.
Exactly. And they also emphasize that the public, while maybe not always possessing detailed policy knowledge, generally does have a good grasp of its own values and interests. And those perspectives shouldn't be dismissed.
Absolutely.
Huh.
They argue that a healthy democracy requires more than just technical expertise. It requires a system where the voices of all citizens are heard and considered, and where policy decisions are made transparently and accountably.
Right. It's about creating a system that is truly responsive to the needs and aspirations of all its people.
So this deep dive has brought to light some uncomfortable truths about the distribution of power in the United States. But it's also a reminder that democracy isn't a spectator sport. It demands active participation, critical thinking, and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
Absolutely. We need to be engaged, we need to be informed, and we need to hold our elected officials accountable for the decisions they make.
We hope this exploration has given you the insights and tools to engage in these vital conversations about the future of our democracy. Thank you for joining us.